Welcome everyone to the Pick Six podcast, where we discuss the biggest stories in college football. I am your host, Chris Cheng, and today I am riding solo dolo, but we have a major story to go over, so let's jump into it. The Honorable Judge Claudia Wilkin has finally approved a settlement in the House versus NCAA antitrust case, opening the door for schools to finally pay athletes directly beginning on July 1st. I want to know, I will be probably looking at this strictly from a football perspective. So let's get a little background for those of you who may not be fully caught up. Now, the House settlement is emerging of three separate antitrust cases, the House, Carter, and Hubbard cases, each related to questions around athletes being denied ability to profit off their name, image, and likeness, NIL. Now, the settlement centers around three crucial facets. The first being a $2.8 billion back pay to athletes dating back to 2016 over lost NIL revenue that will be paid over 10 years, which roughly will equate to about $280 million annually. Now, the new age it also centers on a second facet, which is a new age revenue sharing formula that allows schools to pay athletes directly. We'll get more into that later. The third portion of it is eliminating restrictions on scholarship numbers in favor of roster limits. Now, the back pay portion, which is the biggest part of this case, this settlement, will be largely paid for and shouldered by the NCAA and the Power Four conferences, the ACC, the Big Ten, the Big 12, the SEC, and sadly the nearly defunct Pac-12. Yeah, Pac-12, you're going to get stuck with the bill too. So let's look at what I think are three of the biggest things to come out of this settlement. The first is payers getting paid directly from schools under the newly approved settlement. Schools can now directly pay athletes from this $20.5 million a year cap. That will grow incrementally over the 10-year life period of this settlement. Now, this isn't for just the football team. This is actually for the entire athletic department for this entire cap, which kind of becomes an issue when you think that a lot of football rosters balloon this cap well over 20.5. So another thing to look at also in this is actually separate from NIL. So when the schools will be paying the athletes directly, you have to remember this is going to come from this revenue sharing formula, which includes ticket sales, the media rights that they're getting from Fox, ESPN, and CBS, along with concession, parking, etc. Anything that has to do around college athletics is going to kind of be poured into like this little bucket, and then that's going to be disseminated to the athletes. The way they got to that $20.5 million cap is they basically took about 22% of the revenue that college sports brings in, and they're giving that to the athletes, which in itself could be a problem. Again, later in the show. Another thing I thought that was important about this settlement is the limits on roster size. Rosters will now have to cut down to 105 spots. Teams will no longer have to decide who gets a scholarship and who doesn't. Before this ruling, there was a scholarship limit of 85, with there being an average of 125 players on the roster. So the old model basically looked at there being about 125 players on a roster on any team, on a football team, and then only 85 of those players would get scholarships. So you'd have to figure out, okay, who do I want to give the scholarship to? Sometimes it made for great, situations where, kids who had been working their tail off for either a season or two finally got the scholarship. But there was also a large portion of players who didn't have scholarships. And so that will now be done away. The roster limits will become effective for the 2025 and 2026 academic year. And I've also detailed how anyone identified as a designated student athlete will not count against the roster limit. So basically, before this settlement, any person on a team who wasn't given a scholarship before will be designated as a student athlete. Basically, they will not count towards the roster. They will be grandfathered in. The third portion of the settlement that I thought was really important was the creation of a governing body. This is what they're calling the College Sports Commission. Now, the College Sports Commission is the new governing body and is expected to be headed up by longtime MLB exec Brian Seeley. Now, Seeley has spent nearly 11 years in baseball and previously worked as an assistant U.S. attorney for the better part of about a decade. Now, the CSC will be the central enforcement arm in this new era and will report to the Power Five Conference commissioners. The organization will oversee all enforcement of the House settlement terms, including revenue sharing, NIL, and roster limits. Now, student athletes will be required to report any third-party NIL deals over 600 to NIL Go, which will be the new independent NIL clearinghouse. Basically, think of it like a database where everyone's got to submit all of their NIL deals into. Now, additionally, deals signed before June 6th but have payments after July 1st will have to be reported. Anything after June will also have to be reported. NIL Go reviews whether the payer of the NIL deal is an associated entity or associated individual. It determines whether the compensation is within an acceptable range of compensation, fair market value, and whether the NIL activity is for a valid business purpose to promote goods for services that are available to the general public for profit. This is basically their way of saying we want to make sure this is not pay for play. Now, I think this will be one of the most impactful decisions in college football, mainly because it gets the ball rolling on overdue changes that are needed in the sport. But this is no silver bullet, guys. Let's not think of this as, oh, our troubles are gone, we're good to go. Let's get kickoff going in August. I want to look at some of the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to the House settlement. First, let's take a look at the good. Former athletes will finally be compensated. I've said it for years. I believe for years that athletes should be paid. This is a billion-dollar industry, multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's sad that the people who are involved in sports, and again, I'm now going to go outside the realm of football, in all sports, whether it's baseball, basketball, hockey, whatever it is, that they're going to now be compensated because a lot of these players devote their entire life, their college lives, to these sports. They don't get a college experience per se. I know a lot of people will argue and say, well, they're getting a scholarship. That should be good enough. That's not really it. I mean, these guys literally are working from sun up to sundown. They are focused. If they're not in practice, specifically football too, I'll speak to that. They're up at 5 a.m. and then they're not getting back to their dorm rooms maybe till 8 o'clock at night. You know what I mean? Between practices, team meetings, and then classes. So I think them getting compensated now, it's fair. I think this is also a positive step in regulating NIL. I think the ability for us to have some sort of guardrails, while this, again, I said, is not the silver bullet we need, and this is not going to be the end all be all of problems for college sports, specifically college football. I do think this is a great step in changing NIL and changing the narrative around NIL being the wild, wild west. Um, so that's kind of the good. Former athletes getting paid, those athletes who dedicated their lives getting reimbursed. While I know it's nowhere near what kids are getting paid now, it's nice. I think it's also nice that now moving forward, schools will have to split some of their revenue with the players. Now that leads us into the bad. I want to kind of get into the bad things, and sadly, I don't want to be a pessimist. I like to think of myself as a realist. So the first thing I think this is going to create an issue with is it's going to create a wider gap between the haves and the have nots. So we talked about this $20.5 million cap that all schools are going to have to share with their players. Now, like I said, and I alluded to before, this is for the entire athletic department, right? So some schools are going to say, and the estimates are most schools are probably going to be putting anywhere between 70 to 80% of that budget towards football, about 10 to 15 towards men's basketball, 5% to women's basketball, and then the rest to the rest of the sports. That's now going to force a lot of schools to pick what sports they want to invest in, right? Like you've heard this phrase a lot, right? They're a basketball school, or they're a football school, or they're a baseball school. Even some schools are really good at baseball. And so you're going to see programs cut their funding to a lot of different sports, and they're going to probably start focusing on the ones that make them not only the most money, but the ones that they're the most successful in. And that in itself is going to create a larger gap between, like I said, the haves and have nots. For Alabama, for the Power Four school, most of the Power Four schools, not all of them, because there are definitely some, I'll note some in a few minutes. The $28.5 million cap, it's nothing. But for a lot of schools, especially like in the G5, and even when you get into even some smaller schools in the Power Four conferences, are they going to be able to allot, 20 million to this settlement? It could break the bank. I don't know. And I know a lot of schools, I think one that a lot of pundits were talking about this past season, like an Iowa State, for example, it's not like these people are bringing in billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars to equate. Because, like, the best way of kind of giving you an analogy is, let's say you have a budget, right? And you're working on thin margins, right? Now, imagine we're going to say, hey, 20% of that budget now, hey, it's going to go towards a whole new thing. So you now need to carve out 20% of your profits and allot it towards this. that is going to literally be an iceberg for a lot of programs and could sink. And so I think that's a major deterrent and a bad thing that comes out of this settlement. I think we're also going to see a lot of the Olympic sports and club sports die off because they will either lose funding or see such a drastic cut that it'll just naturally phase them out. And so it's like they're either going to have to go to private equity or fundraising, which not everyone's going to be able to do. And so you're going to see a lot of these club sports and a lot of these Olympic sports kind of just, again, either flat out die out, like they'll just say, hey, we're just cutting swimming, or we're cutting gymnastics, or whatever it is, and we're just going to put the money towards this because that's all our budget has. And then the last thing I thought was kind of the bad thing, and I've kind of been alluding to it the entire show, is this is not the silver bullet. This doesn't even cut into the deepest issue that college football faces, which is a governing entity. Now you're saying, Chris, I thought you just said they just created this new commission. Yeah, they did create this new commission, but if you were listening, you notice it only revolved around those three things, the three tenets of this settlement. It doesn't go over any of the other things. There's no policing. There's no overarching body. And actually, this is going to create an issue with the NCAA because everyone's saying, oh, now this is the death of the NCAA. Well, not quite really, because the thing is the CSC is only responsible for the issues pertaining to this settlement. Everything else in college sports, including college football, will be handled by the NCAA, which is a mess in itself. So we're kind of not quite back at ground zero, but we're not that far ahead, right? So that's where I think some of the bad things that are coming out of this settlement. Lastly, we've got to look at the ugly. This is the stuff that I'm like, man, this is worse than bad, and this is going to create. I think these are the problems that are created from this, right? And the first are the lawsuits. I think we are going to see an unparalleled amount of lawsuits than we've ever seen in college sports, period. Because again, while I am speaking about this from a strictly college football angle, you got to remember, guys, there are dozens of sports that fall under any athletic department umbrella, right? And so people are going to be suing, and people are going to be taking this settlement to court because it's going to impact them in some way, whether it's financially, whether it's going to be logistically, whether it's going to be, again, phasing them out, or them losing funding and no one wanting to do it anymore. So you're going to see people coming through with lawsuits. And on top of that, you're probably going to see lawsuits from players, right? Because who's to say 20% is enough, right? The 22%, remember the number I was telling you, the $20.5 million cap that all the schools are going to have to buy into or opt into? Well, guess what? These schools are getting paid way more. And who's to say 20.5 million is fair for a lot of these players, right? When we're talking about $1 billion industry, and some of these schools and programs are making hundreds of millions of dollars, you know, is that going to be enough? Don't be surprised if you see a few players saying, hey, I want more. I need more. Next, we haven't even remotely talked about, which is already occurring. The settlement also notably does not address Title IX and whether athletes should be classified as employees. That's going to be a major issue. Title IX alone. We've already seen there have been 2 lawsuits that have been filed already on behalf of female athletes because, like I was saying, the the assumption is most programs are going to devote about 70 to 80% to football, 10 to 15 to basketball. I mean, you're already in about a 95 percentile of going to men's sports, leaving only 5% for women's sports. That rails directly against Title IX. So this is clashing with that. And that's why I brought the lawsuits first and then this next, because we've already got 2 lawsuits. Who knows how many more are coming on the pike? And then the issue of our students athletes, because if the university's paying them, wouldn't that kind of make them athletes? This settlement doesn't really acknowledge that, and that becomes an issue. Each presents their varying challenges that will need to be dealt with in time. And when I use the wording need, because how much longer can this go on, right? Are we going to see women's sports again fall down to only 5%? I'm not saying they do or do not deserve more, but again, when you have Title IX, you have something railing against this settlement. It doesn't really kind of make sense. Lastly, we may start to see the death of the walk-on system in this house era. Nebraska had 180 players on their roster last year, and now need to cut that down by 75 players with only 105 roster spots being available. Coaches are going to have to severely limit walk-on spots, if not cut them out altogether, depending on whether the league allows it. And with an influx of talent in portal and fewer walk-on spots available, schools that champion the walk-on process might cease to place a similar emphasis on non-scholarship players. So, in other words, if you're saying again, yes, everyone's going to be on scholarship who's on team, but we're still going to shrink the team. Are we going to allow people to walk on? You know, are we going to allow, like, when with the transfer portal now becoming the standard? Where do we go with that? And a lot of former players and a lot of pundits will tell you, the walk on system is crucial to the sport. It's a tangible of the sport. It's a facet of the sport that is what makes it really special. You don't see in the NFL as much that many walk-ons, right? Maybe you hear the story one, two players on a team will walk on and try out and either make the team going beyond the scout team and start. But you have a lot of this in college football where guys will, walk on and then they become a crucial part of that team, you know? And so I wonder with the settlement now coming in place, are we going to see, because of the roster limits, this whole walk-on phase just completely get phased out of college sports? And again, I know I'm speaking on this from a football perspective, but again, you can walk on basketball, you can walk on baseball, whatever the sport is, you can walk on. You don't necessarily have to get a scholarship. So, what does that do to each sport and each team? Next, the new model will also strain most schools financially. Again, I was alluding to this too with the Iowa State issue and some other schools. This is going to force a lot of programs to pass that fee on to the fans to pay the players, right? Uh, I don't see, again, I brought up Iowa State. I don't see Iowa State anytime soon, not making that budget and then also not being able to raise those funds. They're going to, it's just how are they going to do that? They're going to pass that on to the fans. I mean, schools are already finding ways to generate extra cash in order to pay up that $20.5 million cap. Expect to see a lot more schools implementing what's called a talent tax, as they have in Knoxville for the Tennessee Volunteers, or even increased ticket prices, which everyone I think has seen over the last decade, as the Longhorns in Texas plan to do. Now, if schools like Tennessee and Texas are doing this, you can only imagine the challenges to smaller schools that are facing, and even schools like a mid-tier program like Miami, which, I'm not saying in talent, but just in terms of financing and in terms of budget, like Miami doesn't have the same financial stability as like an Alabama or an Ohio State, right? Where you have these pools of alumni who are like 65,000, a year, sometimes as upwards. Some of these small private schools only have 10,000 students annually. And again, it's going to be hard for them, even if they were to get a dollar from each, alumnus, it's still going to be hard to close that gap, which is why I said in the previous segment, the bad is it's going to create a wider gap between the haves and have-nots. And we've already seen a few Division One schools even make the move to Division Three. They've dropped themselves down after realizing they're not able to compete, not on the field, but just financially. And so, lastly, I want to look at some of the lingering questions. There are some pressing questions I think we really need to ask when it comes to this settlement moving forward. The first is, now that schools can pay athletes, will contracts become the new standard? Will players be forced to stay at an institution for an extended period of time to qualify for the revenue share? Who knows? I know the Big Ten was floating that around last year. They were making a lot of their athletes sign agreements leading up to this to say, hey, if you're going to engage in this revenue share, you're going to need to stay here at least 2 years. Is that going to be the norm? I don't know. I think that's something important that we need to look at. I think, how will the revenue share and NIL coexist? Remember, I mentioned earlier, these are not the same. The 20.5 million cap for athletic departments has nothing to do with NIL. NIL is still going to move forward. Yes, they have NIL Go to kind of like figure out whether it's pay for play or not. We know it's not. But how are you going to manage those two things? Again, because you're already now putting a financial burden on the institution, saying, hey, 20% of your budget now needs to go to this agreement. But also, hey, like, those schools have collectives and have entities that are paying their players way more. Like, you've got to figure this out. So I think that's another important question to ask ourselves. Will payments be backloaded to incentivize players to stay? Like these kids are transferring in and out. We're seeing kids mid-season, even like in the example of Nico Maliava in December, midway through the season, well, not midway, but towards the end of the season, going to the coaching staff and saying, "Hey, I want more money." Like, are people going to now start backloading all of their NIL deals to say, "Hey, like if you want to get paid this amount, we're going to pay you weekly, but understand it's going to gradually go up." I don't know. We're going to have to wait and see. Another question I would want to know and want to pose is, how can any entity manage the influx of NIL deals that will be coming down the pike? Again, this is not NIL Go will not just be looking at football. It will be looking at every college sport with multiple rosters with hundreds of people on each team. How, just, my brain, I freeze and thinking, how is this one entity going to manage every single deal? I mean, it's going to make taking a sip from a hose look like child's play. I mean, it's going to be like a little sip from a straw. But I mean, the influx of deals you're going to see coming through, and how do you manage that? And then on top of that, how do you hold the magnifying glass to certain deals and not others? Like, who's going to get the scrupulous look? Is it going to be, not to play victim, but is Miami's deals going to be looked at harder than Ohio State's deals? Are USC's deals going to be looked at tougher than Penn State's? I mean, this is going to create an issue where, you know are people going to be calling each other out? It's going to get a little messy, and these are questions that I would want to know. Another question I have, I alluded to it earlier, is 20% going to be enough for the players, right? They decided on 20%, but we all know the players are putting their bodies out there. They are the main reason why people watch the sport. I mean, no one cares that Dan Lanning in Oregon is a great coach and let's see what scheme he's drawing up on Saturday. No one cares about that. And so, is 20% enough? Right. And so, with that, another question is, will we see the players unionize and push for a CBA? Right. Like 20%. Okay, that's cool for now. And maybe the budget goes up naturally because the payments will go up each year. But if they unionize, are they going to feel like that 20% is enough? I don't think so. And then, are they going to be allowed to have a CBA, a collective bargaining agreement, right? Like the NFL does, so that everyone is happy on both sides. I it's not addressed in the settlement. It's not even alluded to. And that's why I said this whole thing is kind of just a stepping stone. It's great, but it's not even remotely close to what we really need. And lastly, this is probably the most important question, and I've been alluding to it the entire show so far, but what happens in 10 years when the settlement concludes? Where do we go from here? This is only for those three tenants we discussed earlier, right? The paying students directly, the um, the roster size limit, and the back pay. Again, what about all the other issues? What about tampering? What about NIL guardrails on NIL? None of that is discussed. And so this is great for now, but this only lasts for 10 years. What are we going to do in 10 years? Do we revert back to what we had before this? Do players not get paid? Do they just throw out the agreements? It's not to say that I'm upset that it's only 10 years, but I think we need to I hope that the ball is already rolling on how to fix college football. That is beyond this settlement. This settlement, like I said, is just a brick in the wall. We have to zoom out, look at the wall, and say, okay, this is how we're going to fix it. And I think naturally, I think the biggest issue we have is, like I said earlier, a lack of a universal governing body. Not just the SEC. It's not just thanking the SEC. It's got to be everyone. The Big 12, the Big 10, the ACC. They all need to be governed. Everyone needs to have the same rules, and everyone, not on top of having the same rules, needs to have the same opportunities, right? Whether that's a cap in general with NIL deals, if there is, in my opinion, and maybe we'll do this as a how to fix college football NIL episode, which I, I think you should even have tiers, right? So, like, okay, like everyone's going to get paid the same. and we'll all opt into it, right? And again, some schools won't be able to opt into it, and that's fine, but that will help us clear the herd a little bit. But if you're a starting wide receiver, this is what you make. If you're the second string, this is what you make. And you tier it, right? And then that way everyone knows, hey, everyone's fair, everything is fair. I think there needs to be a governing body. Someone needs to do something like that. I'm not saying I have all the answers, but I think there needs to be an overarching governing body that's not just the NCAA, not just the CSC, but something that's like a hodgepodge of both that actually sets out rules that will level the playing field. I understand you people that are watching this are always screaming, there is no way to make it fair. I understand that 100%. But if we're already moving to an NFL model, and that's what college football wants to be, I don't, but that's what college football wants to be, then you need to start acting and dressing like it. You can't hold on to vestiges of the past while at the same time trying to move forward in a certain direction to look a certain way. It just won't work. You have to commit to one of the two. So those are some of the things, some of my takeaways, some of my questions, the good, the bad, the ugly on the House versus NCAA settlement. What did you guys think? I want to know what your thoughts were. What are your answers to some of the questions that I had towards the end? I would love to know. And let me know in the comments. I also want to thank Brennan. Me and him were going back and forth in the comment sections on our last ranking video. I love that. Let's get into it, guys. Let's chop it up in the comments. I don't take any of this stuff personally. I love hearing from you guys. I love hearing reviews. Even the guys who say this is the worst take in college football. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your opinion. I take it all. I love it all. But guys, we have another one in the books. Thank you all for watching. Until next week, be good, y'all. Win the weekend. And as always, go Canes.